It's my privilege to introduce authors, usually sitting in Studio C at KPFK. So you can imagine my delight at being offered the opportunity to introduce the main event. Here we go. Calling All Rebels was the title of an online article posted by our very special guest speaker tonight at the most excellent truthdig.org back in March 2010, but it might as well be his and our campaign slogan, today and forever. Its gorgeous echoes and reverberations of that unshy and sincere and yet almost never elsewhere heard call to action, to conscience, to solidarity, by way of, as Noam Chomsky calls it, the vigorous exercise of intellectual self-defense. We are treated in public, ladies and gentlemen, like naughty, slightly stupid, and obedient children by the elites of our nation and their sycophants, pimps, talking heads, and administrators, those salesmen of easy plastic-wrapped desires, and yes, a shiny weapon and ammo for every fool or coward or kook who can buy or steal one. The glass, we are told, is either half full or half empty, and we must think outside the box. We are idealists and utopians for exercising our imaginings beyond only fearing foreigners or delivering our lives to the manufacturers of weapons used to blackmail us and murder strangers in faraway lands, affirmed daily as unreal because they are not mirror images of our narcissistic masters. Writer, activist, literary, and philosophical teacher Chris Hedges is here to remind those who will listen that intellect and spirit are shared and worth sharing, that the glass, both half full and half empty, is in fact owned by Bechtel Corporation, Chase, Walmart, Halliburton, Dow Chemical, Goldman Sachs, AIG, you know who they are. And to insist for you and for me that free people do not think or live or exist in boxes, and that the box itself of ideology, militarism, anti-intellectualism, capitalism, racism, misogyny must be torn apart. And that, no kidding, we already live in a thriving utopia, one controlled by the wealthy, a paradise built on a purposefully constructed system which can, real newsflash, also be questioned, challenged, and torn apart. Chris Hedges has put out the call in journalism, books, activism, teaching, and in witness. You good people, each rebels in your own way, have answered that call here, tonight, in, of all places, Orange County, California, USA. Please welcome now one of our favorite rebels indeed, Chris Hedges.
Well, before I begin on the issue of Bernie Sanders, I will not betray the Palestinian people ever. Which means that I will not support Bernie Sanders or anyone who does not stand up for the oppressed, all of the oppressed. I'm tired of selling the Palestinians out. That's over. And if we're not willing to fight that battle, we're not going to fight any battle. He's an AIPAC wind-up doll like the rest of them. Look at that Senate vote. We live in a revolutionary moment. The disastrous economic and political experiment that attempted to organize human behavior around the dictates of the global marketplace has failed. The promised prosperity that was to have raised the living standards of workers through trickle-down economics has been exposed as a lie. A tiny global oligarchy has amassed obscene wealth, while the engine of unfettered corporate capitalism plunders resources, exploits cheap, unorganized labor, and creates pliable, corrupt governments that abandon the common good to serve corporate profit. The relentless drive by the fossil fuel industry for profits is destroying the ecosystem, threatening the very viability of the human species. And no mechanisms to institute genuine reform or halt the corporate assault are left within the structures of power which have surrendered to corporate control. The citizen has become irrelevant. He or she can participate in heavily choreographed elections, but the demands of corporations and banks are paramount. History has amply demonstrated that the seizure of power by a tiny cabal, whether a political party or a clique of oligarchs, leads to despotism. Governments then cater exclusively to a narrow interest group and redirect the machinery of state to furthering the interests of that group, are no longer capable of responding rationally in times of crisis. Blindly serving their masters, they acquiesce to the looting of state treasuries to bail out corrupt financial houses and banks, while ignoring chronic unemployment and underemployment, along with stagnant or declining wages, crippling debt peonage, a collapsing infrastructure, and the millions left destitute and sometimes homeless by deceptive mortgages and foreclosures. A bankrupt liberal class holding up values it does nothing to defend, discredits itself, as well as the purported liberal values of a civil democracy, as it is swept aside along with those values. In this moment of political, economic, or natural disaster, in short, a crisis, will ignite unrest, lead to instability, and see the state carry out draconian forms of repression to maintain order. This is what lies ahead. And we will, as Frederick Engels wrote, either make a transition to socialism or barbarism. If we do not dismantle global capitalism, we will descend into the Hobbesian chaos of failed states, mass migrations, which we are already witnessing, and endless war. Populations, especially in the global south, will endure increased misery and high mortality rates caused by collapsing ecosystems and infrastructures on a scale not seen since perhaps the Black Plague. There can be no accommodation with global capitalism. We will overthrow this system. Let me repeat that word for Homeland Security. That's overthrow. We will overthrow this system or be crushed by it. And at this moment of crisis, we need to remind ourselves what being a socialist means and what it does not mean. First and foremost, all socialists are unequivocal anti-militarists and anti-imperialists. They understand that there is no genuine social, political, economic, or cultural reform as long as the militarists and their corporate allies in the war industry continue to loot and pillage the state budget, leaving the poor to go hungry, working men and women in distress, and the infrastructure and social services to be neglected or slashed in the name of austerity. The psychosis of permanent war, which infect the body politic and has done so since after World War I, with the internal and external war on communism, and which today is mutated into the war on terror, is used by the state to strip us of civil liberties, redirect our resources to the war machine, and criminalize democratic dissent. We have squandered trillions of dollars and resources in endless and futile wars from Vietnam to the Middle East at a time of ecological and physical crisis. And the folly of endless war is one of the signs of a dying civilization. One F-22 Raptor fighter plane costs $350 million, and we have 187 of them. One Tomahawk cruise missile costs $1.41 million, and we fired 161 of them at Libya. And that attack alone cost us $250 million. We spend an estimated $1.7 trillion a year on war, far more than the official 54% of discretionary spending, or roughly $600 billion. And if we do not break the back of the war machine, profound change will be impossible. We have been at war almost continuously since the first Gulf War in 1991, followed by Somalia in 1992, Haiti in 1994, Bosnia in 1995, Serbia, Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, where we have now been fighting for 14 years, and Iraq in 2003. And we can toss in Yemen, Libya, Pakistan, and Syria, along with Israel's proxy war against the Palestinian people. The human cost has been horrendous. Over 1 million lives lost in Iraq. Millions more displaced or refugees. Iraq will never be reconstituted as a unified state, and it was our war industry that created the mess. We attacked a country that did not threaten us and had no intention of threatening its neighbors, and destroyed one of the most modern infrastructures in the Middle East. We brought not only terror and death, including the Shiite death squads that we armed and trained, but power outages, food shortages, and the collapse of basic services from garbage collection to sewer and water treatment. We dismantled Iraq's institutions, disbanded its security forces, threw its health service into crisis, and engineered massive poverty and unemployment. And out of the chaos rose insurgents, gangsters, kidnapping rings, jihadists, and rogue military groups, including our hired mercenaries. Gary Leop, in an article in Counterbunch titled, "How George W. Bush Destroyed the Temple of Baal," got it when he wrote, "Bush destroyed the law and order which had permitted girls to walk to school heads uncovered in modern Western dress. He destroyed the freedom of physicians and other professionals to go about their work and caused masses of them to exit their country. He destroyed neighborhoods where residents were forced to flee for their lives. He destroyed the Christian community, which dropped from 1.5 million in 2001 to perhaps 200,000 a decade later. He destroyed the prevalent ideology of secularism and ushered in an era of bitterly contested sectarian rule. He destroyed the right to broadcast rock and roll music or sell liquor and DVDs. He destroyed the stability of Anbar province by sowing the chaos that allowed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi to establish, for the first time, an al-Qaeda branch in Iraq. He destroyed the stability of Syria when al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, now ISIL, retreated into that neighboring country during the surge of 2007. By creating power vacuums and generating new chapters and spin-offs of al-Qaeda, he destroyed the Yazidi communities and their freedom from genocide and slavery. By hatching the forerunner of ISIL, he destroyed the prospects for a peaceful Arab Spring in Syria 3 years after his presidency ended. Through his actions, he destroyed the border between Syria and Iraq. He destroyed the tomb of Jonah in Mosul. He destroyed 3,300-year-old monuments, the glorious art of the Assyrians in Nimrod. On August 23rd, while sitting in his home artist studio in Crawford, Texas, he destroyed the 2,000-year-old temple of Baal Shamin in Palmyra, Syria. The most complete structure in that gorgeous pearl of an ancient preserved city, a mix of Roman, Syrian, and Egyptian artistic influences, is now a pile of rubble. Foreign battlefields are laboratories for the architects of industrial slaughter. They perfect the tools of control and annihilation on the demonized and the destitute. But these tools eventually make their way back to the heart of empire. As the corporatists and the militarists disembowel our nation, rendering our manufacturing centers boarded up wastelands and tossing out citizens into poverty and despair, the methods of subjugation familiar to those on the outer reaches of empire migrate back to us. Wholesale surveillance, indiscriminate use of lethal force in the streets of our cities against unarmed citizens, a stripping away of civil liberties, a dysfunctional court system, drones, arbitrary arrests, detention, and mass incarceration. The tyranny empire imposes on others, as Thucydides reminded us, it finally imposes on itself. Those who kill in our name abroad soon kill in our name at home. Democracy is snuffed out. As the German socialist Karl Liebknecht said during the First World War, the main enemy is at home, and we will destroy the engines of endless war and shut down the war profiteers, or we will become the next victims. Indeed, many in our marginal communities already are its victims. You cannot be a socialist and an imperialist. You cannot, as Bernie Sanders has done, support the Obama administration's wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen and be a socialist. You cannot, as Sanders has done, vote for every military appropriations bill, including every bill and resolution that empowers and sanctions Israel to carry out its slow-motion genocide of the Palestinian people and be a socialist. And you cannot laud, as Sanders has done, military contractors because they bring jobs to your states. Sanders may have the rhetoric of inequality down, but he is a full-fledged member of the Democratic caucus, which kneels before the war industry and their lobbyists. No genuine grassroots movement will ever be born within the bowels of the Democratic Party establishment. Because none of these elected officials dare challenge any weapons systems, no matter how costly or redundant. And Sanders, like all elected officials, profits from this Faustian pact. The Vermont Democratic Party leadership, in return for his deference, has not supported any candidate to run against Sanders since 1990. Sanders endorses Democratic candidates no matter how much they push neoliberalism down our throats, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And Sanders carrying water for the Democrats is the primary obstacle to building a third party in Vermont itself. Now, there is a reason no establishment politician will say a word about the war industry. Because if you do, you end up like Ralph Nader, tossed into the political wilderness. Nader was not afraid to speak this truth. And it is in the wilderness, I'm afraid, that real socialists must, for the moment, reside. Socialists understand that if we do not dismantle the war industry, nothing, absolutely nothing will change. Indeed, things will only get worse. War is a business. Imperial wars seize natural resources on behalf of corporations and ensure the profits of the arms industry. And this is as true in Iraq as it was in our campaigns of genocide against Native Americans. As A. Philip Randolph said, it is only when it is impossible to profit from war that wars will be dramatically curtailed, if not stopped. No one is sitting in the boardroom of General Dynamics hoping for peace in the Middle East. No one in the Pentagon, especially the generals who build their careers by managing wars, prays for a cessation of conflict. War, wrapped in the cant of nationalism and the euphoria that comes with a giddy celebration of power and violence, is used by ruling elites to thwart and destroy the aspirations of working men and women and distract us from our own disempowerment. Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder, and that is war in a nutshell, said the 5-time socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs during World War I. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. Debs, who in 1912 received almost 1 million votes, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for saying this. I've been accused of obstructing the war, Debs said in court. I admit it. I abhor war. I would oppose war if I stood alone. Debs, who spent 32 months in prison until 1921, also delivered to many a socialist credo at his sentencing after being found guilty of violating the Espionage Act. Your Honor, he said, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings. And I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I say then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. The capitalist class and its doppelgangers in the military establishment have carried out what John Ralston Saul calls a coup d'etat in slow motion. The elites have used war as a safety valve for class conflict. For war, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, creates an artificial community of interest between the oligarchs and the poor, diverting the poor from their natural interests. The redirecting of national frustrations and emotions into the struggle against a common enemy, the cant of patriotism, the endemic racism that is the fuel of all ideologies that sustain war, the false bonding that comes with a sense of comradeship seduces many on the margins of society. They feel in wartime, for perhaps the first time, that they belong. They feel they have a place. They are offered the chance to be heroes. And off they march like sheep to the slaughter. By the time they found out, it is too late. Modern totalitarianism can integrate the masses so completely into the political structure through terror and propaganda that they become the architects of their own enslavement, Dwight MacDonald wrote. This does not make slavery less, but on the contrary more, a paradox there is no space to unravel here. Bureaucratic collectivism, not capitalism, is the most dangerous future enemy of socialism. War, as Randolph Bourne wrote, is the health of the state. It allows the state to accrue to itself power and resources that in peacetime a citizenry would never permit. And this is why the war state, like the one we live in, has to make certain that we are always afraid. Constant violence by the war machine, we are assured, will alone make us safe. Any attempt to rein in spending or expanding power will profit the enemy. It was the militarists and the capitalists at the end of World War II who conspired to roll back the gains made by working men and women under the New Deal. They used the rhetoric of the Cold War to cement into place an economy geared towards total war, even in peacetime. This permitted the arms industry to continue to make weapons with guaranteed profits from the state, and permitted the generals to continue to preside over their fiefdoms. The incestuous relations between the corporatists and the militarists see retired generals and officers offered lucrative jobs in the war industry once they retire. The manufacturing of weapon systems and the waging of war is today the chief activity of the state. It is no longer one among other means of advancing the national interest, but has become the sole national interest. And these corporatists and militarists are the enemy of all socialists. They bankrolled and promoted movements in the early 20th century that called for reforms within the structures of capitalism. These movements that spoke in the language of, quote, the politics of productivism, that eschewed the language of class conflict and talked only about economic growth and a partnership with the capitalist class. The NAACP, for example, was formed to lure African Americans away from the Communist Party, the only radical organization that in the early 20th century did not discriminate. The AFL-CIO was fed CIA money to help crush and supplant radical unions abroad and at home. The AFL-CIO, like the NAACP, is today a victim of its own corruption and bureaucratic senility. Its bloated leadership pulls down huge salaries as its dwindling rank and file is stripped of benefits and protections. And the capitalists no longer need what they once called responsible unionism, which meant pliable unionism. And once the capitalists and the militarists killed off the radical movements and unions, they finished off the dupes who had helped them do it. And that is why less than 12% of our country's workforce is unionized. It is why we have such vast income disparities and chronic unemployment and underemployment. Surplus labor, desperate for work, and unwilling to challenge the bosses in the hope that they will retain a job is the bulwark of capitalism. The radicals, such as the industrial workers of the world, or Wobblies founded by Mother Jones and Big Bill Haywood in 1905, were destroyed by the state. Department of Justice agents in 1912 made simultaneous raids on 48 IWW meeting halls across the country and arrested 165 union leaders. 101 went to trial, including Big Bill Haywood, who testified for 3 days. One of the union leaders told this to the court. You ask me why the IWW is not patriotic to the United States. If you were a bum without a blanket, if you had left your wife and kids when you went west for a job and had never located them since, if your job had never kept you long enough in a place to qualify you to vote, if you slept in a lousy, sour bunkhouse and ate food just as rotten as they could give you and get by with, if deputy sheriffs shot your cooking cans full of holes and spilled your grub on the ground, if your wages were lowered on you when the bosses thought they had you down, if there was one law for Ford, Seward, and Mooney and another for Harry Thaw, if every person who represented law and order in the nation beat you up, railroaded you to jail, and the good Christian people cheered and told them to go do it, how in hell do you expect a man to be patriotic? The Wobblies once led strikes involving hundreds of thousands of workers and preached an uncompromising doctrine of class war. And the Wobblies went the way of the passenger pigeon. The Socialist Party in 1912 had 126,000 members, 1,200 office holders in 340 municipalities, and 29 English and 22 foreign language weeklies, along with 3 English and 6 foreign language dailies. It included in its ranks tenant farmers, garment workers, railroad workers, coal miners, hotel and restaurant workers, dock workers, and lumberjacks, and it too was liquidated by the state. Socialist leaders were jailed or deported. Socialist publications such as The Masses and Appeal to Reason were banned. And the assault, aided later by McCarthyism, has left us without the vocabulary to make sense of our own reality, to describe the class war being waged against us by our corporate oligarchs. And it has left us without the radical movements that, as Howard Zinn made clear, opened up all of the spaces in American democracy. We will regain this militancy, this uncompromising commitment to socialism, or the system the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. Will establish the most efficient security and surveillance state in human history and a species of neo-feudalism. And we must stop pouring our energy into mainstream political campaigns because the game is rigged. We will rebuild our radical movements, or we will become hostages to the capitalists and the masters of war. Fear is the only language the power elite understands. This is a dark fact of human nature. It is why Richard Nixon was our last liberal president. Nixon was not a liberal. He was devoid of empathy and lacked a conscience, but he was frightened of movements. And you do not make your enemy afraid by selling out. You make your enemy afraid by refusing to submit, by fighting for your vision, and by organizing. For it is not our job to take power. It is our job to build movements to keep power in check. You get freedom by letting your enemy know that you'll do anything to get your freedom, then you'll get it, Malcolm X said. When you get that kind of attitude, they'll label you as a crazy Negro, or they'll call you a crazy nigger. They don't say Negro. Or they'll call you an extremist, or a subversive, or seditious, or red, or radical. But when you stay radical long enough, and get enough people to be like you, you'll get your freedom. So don't you run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. And after you get your freedom, your enemy will respect you. And I say that with no hate. I don't have hate in me. I have no hate at all. I don't have hate. I've got some sense. I'm not going to let anybody who hates me tell me to love him. Malcolm X far more, I'm afraid, than Martin Luther King understood America. The New Deal, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a charter member of the oligarchic class, said saved capitalism, was put in place because socialists were strong and a threat. The oligarchs understood that with the breakdown of capitalism, something I expect we will witness in our own lifetimes, there was a real possibility of a revolution. They were terrified they would lose their wealth and power. Roosevelt, writing to a friend in 1930, said, "There was no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for at least one generation. History shows that when this occurs occasionally, nations are saved from revolution." In other words, Roosevelt went to his fellow oligarchs and said, "Hand over some of your money, or you will probably lose all of your money." And his fellow capitalists complied. And that is how the government created 15 million jobs, Social Security, unemployment benefits, and public works projects. The capitalists did not do this because the suffering of the masses moved them. They did this because they were scared. And they were scared of radicals and socialists. We must stop looking for our salvation in strong leaders. Strong people, as Ella Baker said, do not need strong leaders. Politicians, even good politicians, play the game of compromise and are too often seduced by the privileges of power. Sanders, from all I can tell, began his political life as a socialist in the 60s, when this was hardly a bold political statement, but quickly figured out that he was not going to have a seat at the table if he remained one. He wants his seniority in the Senate. He wants his committee chairmanships. He wants his ability to retain his Senate seat unchallenged. And no doubt, this was politically astute. But in the process, he sold us out. Jeremy Corbyn, the new head of the Labour Party, offers another example. He spent 3 decades marginalized, even within his own party, because he held fast to the central tenets of socialism. And as the lie of neoliberalism, championed by the 2 ruling parties in Britain, became apparent, people knew whom they could trust. Corbyn never made an astute career move in his life, and that is why the establishment is so frightened of him. They know they cannot buy Corbyn off, any more than you could buy off Mother Jones, Emma Goldman, or Big Bill Haywood. Integrity and courage are powerful weapons, and we have to learn how to use them. We have to stand up for what we believe in. And we have to accept the risks and even the ridicule that comes with this stance. We will not prevail any other way. As a socialist, I am not concerned with what is expedient or what is popular. I am concerned with what is right. I am concerned with holding fast to the core ideals of socialism, if for no other reason than keeping this option alive for future generations. And these ideals are the only ones that will make possible a better world. If you will not call for an arms embargo, along with a boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, you are not a socialist. If you will not demand we dismantle our military establishment, which after all is managing the government's wholesale surveillance of every citizen and storing all our personal information in perpetuity in government computer banks, and if you will not abolish the for-profit arms industry, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for the prosecution of those leaders, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama, to engage in aggressive acts of preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a crime of aggression, you are not a socialist. If you will not stand with all of the oppressed across the globe, you are not a socialist. Socialists do not pick and choose whom among the oppressed it is convenient to support. Socialists understand that you stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed. That this is a global fight for life against global corporate tyranny. And we will only win when we stand together with the working men and women in Greece, Spain, Egypt, and every other country that has defied the tyranny of global capitalism. If you will not call for full employment and unionized workplaces, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for inexpensive mass transit, especially in impoverished communities, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for universal single-payer health care and a banning of the for-profit health care corporations, you are not a socialist. If you will not raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, you are not a socialist. If you are not willing to provide a weekly income of $600 to the unemployed, the disabled, stay-at-home parents, the elderly, and those unable to work, you are not a socialist. If you will not repeal anti-union laws like the Taft-Hartley Act and trade agreements from NAFTA to the TPP and CAFTA, you are not a socialist. If you will not support 2 years of paid maternity leave, as well as shorter work weeks with no loss in pay and benefits, you are not a socialist. If you will not repeal the Patriot Act in Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as end government spying on citizens, along with mass incarceration, you are not a socialist. If you will not put into place laws that prohibit all forms of male violence against women and criminalize the trafficking and pimping out of prostituted girls and women while not criminalizing the exploited girls and women, you are not a socialist. If you do not support a woman's right to control her own body, you are not a socialist. If you do not support full equality for GBLT community, you are not a socialist. If you do not declare global warming a national and global emergency and devote our energy and resources to saving the planet through public investment in renewable energy and an end to our reliance on fossil fuels, you are not a socialist. If you will not nationalize all public utilities, including the railroads, energy companies, and the banks, you are not a socialist. If you will not support government funding for the arts and public broadcasting to create places where creativity, self-expression, and voices of dissent can be heard and seen, you are not a socialist. If you will not terminate our nuclear weapons program and build a nuclear-free world, you are not a socialist. If you will not demilitarize our police, and this means that police no longer carry weapons when they patrol our streets. They must rely on specialized units that have to be specially authorized case by case to use lethal force, and if you don't do this, you are not a socialist. If you will not support government training and rehabilitation programs for the poor and those in our prison system, along with the abolition of the death penalty, you are not a socialist. If you will not grant full citizenship to undocumented workers, you are not a socialist. If you will not declare a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, you are not a socialist. If you will not provide free, state-run mental health care, especially for those caged in our prisons, you are not a socialist. If you will not provide government-funded education from daycare to university and forgive all student debt, you are not a socialist. And finally, if you will not dismantle our empire and bring our soldiers and Marines home, you are not a socialist. Socialists do not sacrifice the weak and the vulnerable, especially children, on the altar of profit. And the measure of a successful society for a socialist is not the GDP or the highs of the stock market, but the right of everyone, especially children, never to go to bed hungry, to live in safety and security, to be nurtured and educated, and to grow up to fulfill his or her potential. I am not naive about the forces arrayed against us. I understand the difficulty of our struggle. But we will never succeed if we attempt to accommodate the current structures of power. Our strength lies in our steadfastness and our integrity. It lies in our ability to hold fast to our ideals, as well as our willingness to sacrifice for those ideals. We must refuse to cooperate. We must march to the beat of a different drum. We must rebel. And we must grasp that rebellion is not carried out finally for what it achieves, but for who it allows us to become.
Yes.
Rebellion sustains us in an age of darkness. It provides hope and the capacity for love. And rebellion must become our vocation. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career, Václav Havel said when he was battling the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well and ends with being branded an enemy of society. The dissident does not operate in the realm of genuine power at all. He or she is not seeking power. He or she has no desire for office and does not gather votes. He or she does not attempt to charm the public. He or she offers nothing and promises nothing. He or she can offer, if anything, only their own skin. And you offer it solely because you have no other way of affirming the truth you stand for. The dissident's actions simply articulate his dignity as a citizen, regardless of the cost. These neoliberal forces are destroying our earth. Polar ice caps and glaciers are melting. Temperatures and sea levels are rising. Species are going extinct. Floods, monster hurricanes, mega droughts, wildfires have begun to eat away at the systems that sustain life. The great mass migrations predicted by climate scientists have begun. And even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, we would still endure the effects of catastrophic climate change. Out of the disintegrating order comes nihilistic violence, which characterizes all societies that fall apart. Mass shootings at home, religious persecution, beheadings, executions by individuals that neoliberalism and globalism has demonized, attacked, and discarded as human refuse. I cannot promise you we will win. I cannot promise you we will even survive as a species. But I can promise you that an open and sustained defiance of global capitalism and the merchants of death, along with the building of a socialist movement, is our only hope. I am a parent, as are many of you, and we have betrayed our children. We have squandered their future. And if we rise up, even if we fail, future generations, and especially those who are most precious to us, will at least be able to say that we tried, that we stood up, that we fought for life. The call to resistance, which will require civil disobedience and jail time, is finally a call to the moral life. In the end, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you.
cuando canto, canto lo que el pueblo siente. Soy del pueblo, pueblo soy, y a donde me lleve el pueblo voy.